Okay, we're live, and I just wanted to tackle Surah 35, the Originator. And this is an ironic title since Allah was not the originator of anything. He was a god, worshipped one of many gods in a pagan pantheon worshipped by pre-Islamic Arabs that Muhammad adopted, co-opted, and grafted his own ideas onto. But in this chapter, it begins, all praise is due to Allah, the originator of the heavens and the earth, the maker of the angels, messengers flying on wings 2, 3, and 4. He increases in creation what he pleases. He, in capital letters here. Surely Allah has power over all things. And that's manifestly false. And even in this introductory paragraph, there are mistakes. For example, he says messengers flying on wings 2, 3, and 4. And for people who've read the Bible, they'll know that angels, what he's describing here are seraphim, seraphs. They're celestial creatures that worship God in heaven, and they make an appearance in Isaiah 6, where it begins, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. Above it stood the seraphims. Each one had 6 wings. With twain he covered his face, and with twain he covered his feet, and with twain he did fly. And one cried unto another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the posts of the door moved at the voice of him that cried, and the house was filled with smoke. And of course, after that, Isaiah is convicted of sin, and he realizes that he needs to be cleansed, and he's cleansed of sin, and then asks that he be sent to his people. But the interesting thing in that passage is that it describes them as each having 6 wings. Here, Muhammad, in the guise of Allah, is saying they have 2, 3, 4, doesn't even mention 6. And this is assuming he is referring to the seraphs, the seraphim, which would make sense because they actually do have wings. But Muhammad didn't understand the difference between angels and didn't understand the difference between an angel and a seraph and a cherub and the 4 living creatures. All of these things got kind of jumbled in Muhammad's mind, like everything else. So he assumed that angels actually had wings, even though if you read the Bible and you see angels in their encounters with man, for example, the angels that come down to Sodom on a sort of reconnaissance mission for God, they meet Lot, and the people in Sodom obviously mistake them for men. They think they're men, and Jesus as well. He admonishes his disciples and says that you may entertain, you may encounter an angel unawares who. So in other words, you're mistaking someone who looks like a man but is really in fact an angel. So they don't have wings. Seraphs, other celestial creatures that don't normally come down to earth have wings, but in Muhammad's mind, all of these things are angels because he can't distinguish between these different categories. But even if they had wings, and even if you assume he's referring to the seraphim here, he's still wrong. So you have to keep in mind that even even seemingly minor details are just replete with errors and misunderstandings, and that's typical of the Quran when it describes things. So when you think that belief in angels is one of the 6 articles of faith, you also have to consider the fact that Muhammad's conception of angels wasn't accurate, and it didn't really dovetail with scripture at all. Just like the other articles, like predestination, he had a very confused idea of what predestination is. So you have to consider all these things when you're looking at the 6 pillars, of the 6 articles of faith, or other Islamic beliefs. You have to actually look at the Quran and consider that Muhammad was just very confused on these things, and this is the primary evidence that the Quran is not in fact divine. The fact that it's riddled with mistakes, not just about things that we can't really measure today, but also concrete historical and scientific facts. There are just so many errors. Also about doctrine and what Jews believed and what Christians believe. Repeatedly, it's said that Jews worshipped Ezra, and there's no historical documentation that there was any group of Jews, any even um, heretical group of Jews that ever worshipped Ezra. Although Ezra the scribe was a very important figure. Hi, GW. Um, Even though Ezra was a very significant figure, he and Nehemiah and Zerubbabel, and of course the first high priest of the reconstructed temple, Yeshua, who is the namesake of Jesus. These were all very important figures in the restoration of Israel and bringing them back out of exile and returning to Jerusalem. But no Jews ever worshipped Ezra. Even there's no evidence of even a insignificant, bizarre sect that worshipped Ezra, and there were tons of false messiahs in Second Temple Judaism that are amply documented. Their false prophecies and what they did. There were tons of these false messiahs during Second Temple Judaism, but there's no evidence that there was a sect of Judaism that worshipped Ezra as if he was a god. So that these are just concrete. This is just concrete evidence that Muhammad did not know what he was talking about. And here, his description of what angels look like is just another example of that. So in 4, it says, "And if they call you a liar, truly apostles before you were called liars, and to Allah are all affairs returned." And this is ironic that this is the 4th verse in a surah where, as I just pointed out, there's already, if you don't want to call it a lie, at least a very no, that's a good question. I'm probably going to talk about all of them. I would say the last 30 or 34 surahs are only a paragraph in length. I could probably do those in either one video or 2 videos, but for the time being, it's still worth doing separate videos because most of the surahs now are anywhere between 3 and 6 pages in length, so it's worth doing a separate video for those. But the last I would say 30 or 35 surahs could probably be compressed into one or two videos. But in 4 it says Muhammad again is trying to combat accusations that he's lying. Ironically, in a surah where 3 verses before, as I just pointed out, he's saying something that's completely erroneous. I understood them speaking of Ezra as the son of God. Well, that's the thing. There wasn't any, like I said, in Second Temple Judaism, there were a lot of false messiahs and a lot of people trying to claim to be the Messiah that had been prophesied by David and the prophets. But there's no evidence that there was a group that thought Ezra was either God or the Messiah. He was a scribe who led the Jews who had returned from exile into Jerusalem, and he was a uh, political leader, basically trying to return people back to God, reading the scriptures which had been basically abandoned by Israel and ignored. He was reintroducing them to the law, more or less. But there weren't people that viewed him as a Messiah figure, even though they're in terms of Christology, someone like Ezra and Nehemiah, they do point to hi, love and light, uh, sleepless in Germany. Even though Ezra and Nehemiah, like I said, no one worshipped Ezra or viewed him as a Messiah, but no Jews certainly. But in terms of Christology, they are what they did in terms of leading the Jews out of exile and restoring Israel. That does have implications for Jesus and what he did and what he'll do in the future when Israel turns to him, and God starts dealing with Israel. Hi, Mark. So Ezra and Nehemiah both do have implications in that respect. They're kind of foreshadowing what's going to happen to Israel. In part, what's already happened in terms of it being reconstituted and the Jews being gathered from across the globe and setting up, reestablishing Israel, but also what will happen in the future. So, I mean, there are prophetic implications in Ezra and Nehemiah, particularly, like I said, the first high priest of the Second Temple. His name was Yeshua, and he was the namesake of Jesus. Yeshua is the Hebrew name. Jesus is a Latin transliteration of the Greek rendering of that, which is Jesus. So people in Israel who believe in Jesus would call him Yeshua, or someone who speaks Hebrew. They would refer to him that way. But in terms of Jews actually worshiping Ezra as God, there's no historical evidence to buttress this claim. And you find that throughout the Quran. There are all sorts of claims that have no evidence outside of the Quran. For example, the idea that Jesus was never crucified, or that he was crucified and survived. This idea of a swoon theory. No scholar supports this. Whether they're a Christian or an atheist or Jewish. no scholar supports the idea that Jesus was not crucified, and no one believes in that. Even atheists like Richard Carrier or people who deny that Jesus existed, no one says Jesus existed but was never crucified. The only people who believe this are Muslims, and the only evidence they have is what are Islamic texts. So this is something you find throughout the Quran. Claims like that, or the fact that there were Jews who worshipped Ezra, or that Mary was considered of a Trinity, part of the Trinity. You find things like this that there's no corroborating evidence outside of the Quran, whereas in the Bible, the New Testament, and the historicity of Jesus is attested to by non outside of the Gospels, non-Christian sources like Tacitus and Josephus and Pliny the Younger. You have non non-Christian sources and sources outside of the gospel that attest to the historicity of Jesus and to the lives of and to the lives of his apostles and his disciples, and even the geographical locations of different places that Luke traveled to, or that Paul traveled to. You have archaeological evidence that verifies that. And in the Quran, it's just completely absent. It's like the Book of Mormon, the claims of the Book of Mormon. No archaeologist, no biblical scholar has ever been able to verify any of them. So in 6 it says, surely the shaitan is your enemy, so take him for an enemy. He only invites his party that they may be inmates of the burning fire. As for those who disbelieve, they shall have a severe punishment. And as for those who believe and do good, they shall have forgiveness and a great reward. What is he whose evil deed is made fair seeming to him so much so that he considers it good? Now surely Allah makes err whom he pleases and guides aright whom he pleases. So let not your soul waste away in grief for them. Surely Allah is cognizant of what they do. Now this is interesting because the first in verse 7, in verse 7 it enjoins Muslims to do good, and then it says your good deeds, your evil deeds may seem good to you, and this is a contradiction in the Quran. And if you go to Isaiah 64:6, this is one of the most memorable verses in the book of Isaiah, where it says, but we are all as an unclean thing, and our righteousness are as filthy rags, and we all do fade as a leaf, and our iniquities like the wind have taken us away. And there is none that calleth upon thy name, that stirreth up himself to take hold of thee. For thou hast hid thy face from us, hast consumed us because of our iniquities. And this is something reiterated by Paul in the epistle to the Romans, and also by Jesus, and as an encounter with the rich ruler, where the rich man says, thou good master, and Jesus replies, there's no one is good but God. So this is one of the key points in the gospel message, that people are inherently wicked, and they need an intercessor, someone to redeem them from their sin. But in Islam, as illustrated in these two lines, you have a very confused idea of salvation, and you have someone trying to redeem themselves through good works, even though it in the same breath, Muhammad it not acknowledges that you have no way to discern what is good. So as a human, you don't really have the ability to discern what is good. And as I quote in Isaiah, even our good deeds are filthy when they're examined by God. So you have this internal contradiction that the Quran doesn't resolve, and it can't resolve because they don't have a proper view of salvation or a correct view of God and our relationship to God. And it says in 11, Allah created you of dust, then of the life germ, then he made you pairs, and no female bears, nor does she bring forth except with his knowledge. And no one whose life is lengthened has his life lengthened, excuse me, lengthened, nor is aught diminished of one's life, but it is all in a book. Surely this is easy to Allah. And again, Allah is Muhammad. Again, he says different things, and this is, if you read the Quran, you notice this. He says man is made of dust. Then at other points it says a blood clot. Then it says water. You have 4 or 5 different explanations of what man is made of, and you never have a clear idea of what it is. You have dust, soil, blood clots. He never really explains what man is made of, and also the idea that everything is made in pairs is, I mean, you could say he's simply talking about humans and human reproduction, but of course there are things in the animal kingdom that reproduce asexually. But let's give him the benefit of the doubt and say he's just talking about humans and bears. Then he made you pairs and no female bears, which I don't. I'm going to be honest. I didn't understand what that what that means in this context. I suppose he means there are no bears that bears couple, male and female bears couple, but I honestly have no idea. There are some things in the Quran that just don't make sense, and I'm pretty sure if I understood Arabic, they still wouldn't make sense. And in 12 it says, and the 2 seas are not alike, the one sweet that subdues thirst by its excessive sweetness, pleasant to drink, and the other salt that burns by its saltness. Yet from each of them you eat fresh flesh and bring forth ornaments which you wear. And you see the ships cleave through it, that you may seek of his bounty and that you may be grateful. And this is Muhammad's venture into marine biology. And as I said earlier, there are verses in the Quran which say that the seas are completely separated by a barrier, which is not accurate. He's talking about the oceans, which are made of salt water and freshwater rivers or streams. But in 13 it continues, he causes the night to enter in upon the day, and he causes the day to enter in upon the night, and he has made subservient to you the sun and the moon. Each one follows its course to an appointed time. This is Allah your Lord. He is the kingdom. His is the kingdom, and those whom you call upon besides him do not control a straw. And as I explained in another video, Allah, Muhammad rather, relates a story which is basically a repackaging of the Alexander romance, which claimed that Alexander came to a village where he saw the sun setting in, and in my translation it says uh, the sea. So he saw it setting in the ocean, but in most translations it says a muddy puddle or a pool. So in other words, he saw the sun submerge inside of a pool of water. Mohammed, the marine biologist, yeah, it's kind of laughable, but again, this is something that Muhammad actually believed, that like the sun, when it was setting and you saw it on the horizon, uh, and it looked like, uh, I mean, this is an optical illusion. This is a trick of the eyes. He didn't understand that the world was the Earth was an oblate spheroid, and that the sun was not actually being submerged into the water. It just appeared that way. Um, but yeah, this is repeated a couple of times in the Quran. And in 18 it says, "And a burdened soul cannot bear the burden of another, and if one weighed down by burden should cry for to carry its burden, nor aught of it shall be carried, even though he be near of kin. You warn only those who fear God in secret and keep up prayer. And whoever purifies himself, he purifies himself only for the good of his own soul. And to Allah is the eventual coming." And this also contradicts scripture, which exhorts you to bear one another's burdens. Paul in his epistles urged uh, urged believers to bear each other's burdens. But if you interpret this as meaning someone else's sin, then it's correct. You cannot bear someone else's sin, but only Christ can bear your sin. But even there, it contradicts other parts of the Quran, which say that that Muslims can put their sin onto non-Muslims, so Jews or Christians. Um, uh, yeah, I did ask a question during the Muhammad Hijab David Wood farce at York College. I was there. It took me 3 hours to get there, but I was able to make it through security. They almost kicked me out twice. Well, the second time they did kick me out after the debate ended. That's why I wasn't able to meet David Wood. It's funny because there were actually a couple of Muslims online posing for pictures with him, but me and some of the other Christians and this really obnoxious guy, this Muslim revert, was we were all ushered out. Yeah, it was in Jamaica, and I did ask a question. I don't even remember what the question was because this was so long ago. This was, I think, earlier this year. I'm not sure. I think it was at the beginning of last, either the beginning of last winter or sometime around there. But yeah, I did ask a question towards the very end, and the debate was very bizarre. The only thing noteworthy about the debate was that Mohammed Ajab admitted that he might be going to hell. That was probably the only honest thing he said. Um, oh yeah, Rufus King, an important New York politician who's not a current politician. He's been deceased for a long time, but um, yeah. But that was the only noteworthy thing about the debate when he said he might go to hell and that David Wood might go to heaven. And it's true in Islam. There's no concept of eternal security. So Muslims are always fearful that they're going to hell. And the Arabic thing is interesting. This is a bit of a tangent, but the Arabic thing is interesting because Ibn Warraq, who that's a pseudonym, but he's an Arab atheist who was raised in a Muslim family. And he pointed out that this complaint that we're not using the Arabic translation, it doesn't hold water. Well, I would say that it doesn't make sense because these people are essentially saying God can't communicate. He can only communicate in Arabic, an obscure language at the time that held no importance whatsoever, but apparently is the only language in which he can communicate. But putting that aside, it's also ridiculous because, as Ibn Warraq pointed out, even these people who live in the Middle East and read in a quote unquote Arabic Quran are not reading the Arabic in which it was written. It was written in, I wouldn't even say classical, like pre-classical Arabic. This was a language that was in Kuwait at the time. It wasn't like now we've had hundreds and hundreds of years of Arabic um, poetry or literature, but at the time, most people communicated. It was an oral culture. In fact, this is why you have Muslims always bragging about being a hafiz, or being able to recite the Quran and recite the Quran. And that's not an accomplishment. It just means that you memorized a lot of words that have no meaning to you, you know, or no meaning to anyone else. Uh, all right. No, but I just wanted to point that out. That's a bit of a tangent. I'll finish the surah in my next video. I went way too long on that tangent, but I'll finish it up in my next video. The Originator.